Okay, let's jump straight into this. Most of you are teachers, I'm taking it. So I would first like to entertain this question because this is what I would ask if you're in front of me. And so I would ask you, what influenced your most successful classes or teaching experiences? What did those things have in common? So imagine a class, if you will, where you really felt like the students were engaged, they're getting it, their eyes are lighting up. What contemplate that. If you need to stop the video for a minute, go ahead. But when I've asked this before, it's almost like the zone. It's all, people have heard about, this is optimal zone of performance. And so if you're like me, if I think about my own, optimal teaching experiences where I felt like the students were really engaged and they're, even in counseling, students, people are really picking that up. I'm in tune with them and they're in tune with me. I feel a certain level of anxiety, a certain level of what's called eustress versus distress. Eustress is positive stress. I feel a certain level of anxiety and passion about the topic, and so it comes across. And for me, I'm energetic and I'm full of life, and so are they. And so it's this two-way kind of connection. And when I'm remembering those events, it almost puts me at this calm state internally where I feel like, I've done something good. I've made a difference in somebody's life. That's why each one of us, or most of us, I'm thinking, got into this field. And that's really what I'm hopeful that we can take away from this at the end of the day, is how we can live kind of our life to our fullest potential. And so let's just go straight in and keep going if we can. And so usually I have these questions laid out, what students or parents take the biggest share of your time and energy. So you can think about IEPs, you can think about students in your class that you want to beat your head into the wall. I'm certain that most of you have heard of the ACE study by now. 10 years ago, I would have hypothesized that most of you hadn't. This is something that I've studied in the past 15 years quite intensively in my own training, out of necessity to understand the kids and the families that I was working with. And so by now, many of you have probably also heard of or implemented trauma-sensitive or responsive strategies for your class. I'm going to talk about at the end of today ways to do that. And so just kind of giving you an overview of where we're going. You're welcome to click on this link. You're welcome to stop the video and click on that. I'm not going to take our time looking at that video today, but it's important to recognize that we're dealing with developing brains. Even though some of those may have been impeded, some of those children and youth may are currently be impeding themselves through their own activities and behaviors, still they're developing. They have that capacity to learn. They have that capacity to grow. And I equate that growth to a tree. I liken our brain connections, growing exponentially in really young age and also in adolescence, particularly early adolescence. Those of you who are in the teaching the 13 to 15, 16-year-olds, there, that puberty causes an explosion of neurogenesis, of new connections. And so, with these impulse control behaviors where kids aren't sitting still and they're acting out, and they blurt out things and do things that seemingly are so dumb to us as adults. That's a trial and error thing. Their brains are networking, and they're doing things to help them. Whether it appears on the surface or not, it will help them in the long run. So, really, when we're talking about ACE study, because that's what I'm going to talk about, is we're going to talk about reasons why students generally speaking, the ACE study. I'm not going to. You're welcome to click on that link and watch. I don't want to reiterate this too much at this point because I feel like it's gotten a lot of exposure, rightfully so. Over the past 20 years, it's finally taken traction and given us some direction to hopefully intervene and make some some changes in infancy, childhood, and adolescent to create successful adults instead of having this intergenerational, because that's really what you see is this intergenerational parent dysfunction and, passed on to children, passed on to their children. I'm old enough to kind of see that now. When I first started, it was kind of like, yeah, well, maybe that will break the cycle. And it gets really, it can get really disheartening. But it's also important to realize that we now have very concrete science that shows us where it comes from and how to make a difference. So here are the ACE scores, the ACE factors. I'm not going to go over them in a lot of detail again today. I might take more time if we were together, but just know we're talking about emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, physical neglect, emotional neglect. Number 4, that's been a big one. I'm going to divert for a second here. I had a student here at Northwestern who studied ACEs and wanted to look at teen pregnancy. And what she expected to find was that, teens that had experienced childhood sexual abuse would be the biggest predictor of teen pregnancy. That was a significant predictor, but it actually didn't hold the most weight. And this was, I wish she would publish a study. It's a really good study. It came, it had 70 participants, which is enough to get a good sample. What she found was that the biggest predictor of teen pregnancy was actually physical neglect. Interestingly enough, it was more predictive of a teen becoming pregnant, and teens got pregnant at earlier ages had they experienced physical neglect, even more so than sexual abuse. So what is it that let's remember that, because that's something that we're going to come back to. But it's physical and emotional neglect, separation from a parent, divorce, domestic violence, a parent or caregiver who is an addict or an alcoholic, somebody who was mentally ill, somebody who went to prison. You add up each one of those categories, and that comes up with the ACE score. And so what they found is the more categories that people were in, the worse dysfunction and the harder it is for people to perform in school and also be physically healthy. What did all of those events have in common? This is really important. In each event, it involved a primary relationship being broken or severed. And now that we've really got a lot of it, so it used to be that it was like, 10 years ago when I gave this presentation, it was, well, crap, that really sucks. People, and especially the outcomes we'll look at real quickly, this really sucks. But we've actually found kind of the bullet. It's not just a smoking gun. We've found the bullet, but we've also found the antidote. We've also found how to make this better. We have the answers. We have them right at our fingertips, and that's what's exciting about this. I used to leave this this presentation, this talk, somewhat deflated. I felt like I felt like it was necessary to give, but it was kind of depressing for me in the audience. It was a little hopeful that people would have a little bit more empathy, and I'm hopeful of that as well. Because those are horrible things to live through. That you have some empathy of the kids that are struggling, because when they struggle, when they're shouting, when they're cussing, when they're not listening to you, when they're up, when they're impulsive, it's not a sign that they hate you. It's not a sign that they don't. You're like, yes, it is. They told me to F off. That's in the moment. That's in the moment. They are projecting what has been instilled in them throughout their lives. You are, if you're in middle school, you're an hour or two of their day. And that's most of you in the secondary, step up here in the 6 through 12. You're not much of their day, and so they bring all of these years of experience with them, whether it be with screens, whether it be in abusive situations, whether it be in neglectful situations. They're bringing all these experience with them to you, and they're projecting them onto you. It's if you can just say it's not me. it's not me. Okay, if you're an a-hole or you're being really mean to them, you probably are a trigger, but you're like, but they triggered me. Yes, we'll talk about that. what we're finding here is that there is an oxytocin malfunction. Oxytocin is a hormone that is necessary for human bonding. Oxytocin is a hormone that is released when mothers hold their new babies, when there's, when there's breastfeeding, where there's cuddling, where there's oxytocin is released when there's human bonding. When you go have a cup of coffee and have a laugh with a friend and you share that eye-to-eye gaze and you both laugh and you find something funny together, oxytocin is released. When you share a passionate hug or just an embrace, a warm embrace with somebody, oxytocin is released. When normally when children experience trauma and there's a functional household or functional setting where they're being raised, at some point there's some comfort. There's some comfort knowing that there's a basic love that's, regardless if somebody got into trouble, I'm not going hugs, not drugs, what the whole 9 yards there. I'm basically saying that if at some level people know that they're loved, then it's been my experience that these children and young adults and now adults that I've been able to over 20 years of watching people kind of go through counseling and traumatic experiences and the educational system and come out the other side. In cases where there's a loving, secure relationship somewhere, these are successful cases. Yeah, there's screw ups from time to time, but they tend to be successful adults. In cases where there's not anybody there, these are the trouble. These are the ones that are troubled. And this is where there's an oxytocin malfunction. We'll come back to that. Remember that. I want to spend a little bit of time. That's the antidote. But it has to do with the primary relationship. We're finding that's the issue. And so how does this affect future health? How does this affect future relationships? How does this affect future behavior? How do ACEs affect academic and school performance? Well, that oxytocin malfunction is due for a reason. You're welcome to go in and watch these videos. I don't have time to show them to you today. Here are all the negative outcomes with more of those adverse experiences. Look at COPD, look at stroke, look at kidney disease, heart disease, arthritis, heart attack, asthma, diabetes, cancer. That you can look at 40 health conditions and it's predictive. I mean, it's ACEs are predictive of dysfunction, substance use, smoking, alcoholism, hallucinations, unintended pregnancy, abortion, depression, suicides, antidepressant prescriptions. So if you're interpreting these charts, so this is the likelihood of somebody who has 0 ACEs of receiving antidepressant prescriptions. That's 5 or more. Here's the likelihood of somebody with 0 ACEs attempting suicide versus somebody who's had 4 or more. That's almost 1,400% more likely to attempt suicide. Same thing. That's what these stair steps. Being raped, the incidence of being raped goes up with ACEs. Being a victim of domestic violence goes up. Just being a victim of sexual abuse and having unexplained symptoms, all those, it goes up. ACEs have lasting effects on life potential, graduation rates, academic achievement, lost time from work. ACEs have been found to have a dose-response relationships with 40+ outcomes. So I show you the relationships. I spend a minute talking about this. ACEs predict, if somebody had a lot of ACEs in childhood, 5 or more, they're 400% more likely to have 3 or more marriages. Those are failed relationships. Be experiencing intimate partner violence and being promiscuous in their behavior. That's 600% more likely to have 50 or more sexual partners. The relationships, again, it's key. The oxytocin malfunction, looking for something that wasn't there, looking for attachment. That's going to be a theme throughout this. Here's worker performance. So people, when they grow up and they're getting jobs, if they're absent from work, that's linked to, high absenteeism is linked to ACEs. Financial problems linked to ACEs. Job problems linked to ACEs. Academic problems, academic failure linked to ACEs. Problem with attendance linked to ACEs. Problem with school behavior, no referrals to the office, referrals to the counselor, linked to ACEs. If you're encountering trouble with students, the first thing that should pop into your head is not this kid sucks. It should pop into your head, okay, what has this child experienced? Because they're bringing a lot of intense behavior to my class, to my school, to my environment. What has this child gone through? That's honestly the first thing that should pop into your head. And that is the beginning of being trauma aware. You're welcome to watch this. Again, I share a lot of resources. You're welcome to pause the video, look at the address, type it in. Actually, people with 6 or more in the ACE study, there were 17,500 adults in the original ACE study. It's still ongoing. There's still, I haven't looked at the rates lately, but I believe this is about 10-year-old stat. At one point, people were with 6 or more ACEs died 20 years younger than people with 0 ACEs. I mean, so it negatively impacted their health. So you have these adverse childhood experiences that leads to, there's not a scientific gap here anymore. This is an old model. That leads to cortisol. Cortisol is the bullet. I mean, they found what's hurting people. It's too much cortisol. Cortisol, it causes inflammation. In the short run, it helps us mitigate inflammation. But too much cortisol, it impairs our immune system. It helps, we get sick more, and it actually leads to more inflammation because our body is trying to eliminate these toxic levels of cortisol. That leads to social, emotional, and cognitive impairment. And this adoption of health risk behaviors, that scientific gap has now been filled too. The adoption of health risk behaviors is this search for bonding, this search for attachment. In other words, people know, they may not think, okay, well, yeah, my mom didn't hug me enough, or my dad wasn't there, or people shouldn't have been hurting me when I was growing up, or I should have had food to eat. That's not a cognitive thing. These are feelings. These are very deeply embedded neural networks that work in the underlying parts of your brain. And so the feeling of something not being right, of having this kind of always being on guard, never quite feeling settled, and finding some things, whether it be a screen, whether it be sex, whether it be substances, whether it be gambling, whether it be smoking, whether it be, whatever the vice might be. Folks begin to become attached to that, get fulfillment from, whether it's negative fulfillment, positive, whatever. But they get some attachment from it, and they get reinforced with that, and they know it takes them out of this negative state for a while. That's where the health risk behaviors come in. People looking for attachment, that oxytocin that was missing. This then leads to disease, disability, and social problems, and early death. That pyramid can be more easily explained. There are also things that jump in here with ACEs as well. The ACEs tend to affect our epigenetics, which is a fancy word for above genetics. I mean, what genes get expressed, what we pass on to our offspring. People in society have implicit biases and microaggressions against people who are, golly, this person's just kind of a jerk, or this kid's out of control. And that leads to dysfunction as well. What creates the negative outcomes? Cortisol. It's without a doubt. You can watch the video here. Again, I've got a video there. I encourage you. These videos focus on, these are from Harvard Child Study Center. They focus on really young ages, but please know this dysfunction the brain keeps growing until we're about 25 or 30. So this dysfunction can begin. It's really hard to combat the earlier it is, but it can begin at any age. Um, Basically, these adverse experiences, these traumas create pathways that I'm not going to say, you know what, I want to back off of damaged. I'm wrong. I'll say this slide right here. This slide, this damaged, underdeveloped, and hard to change is right. But I'm gonna back off of that statement. I'm gonna say that it's not dysfunction. You're like, what the hell, Taylor? You don't know what I'm going through in these classes. These kids can't sit still. They're fighting. They're fighting in the hall. We don't know what to do with them. At some point during their development, those behaviors got a need fulfilled. It got attention somewhere, whether it be positive, negative. It fulfilled a need. And so you say, well, this is not right. It's a dysfunction. It's dysfunctional in your environment for the school. It probably wasn't dysfunctional. I'm not going to say probably. At some point, it served a purpose and a function of them growing up in a chaotic, whether it be to fulfill a role where you have an alcoholic dad and they're not going to beat mom if I start acting out, or nobody's paying me attention, so I'm gonna break a bunch of crap in my room. Now people are paying me attention. It's negative attention, but they're still paying attention to me. At some point, and so that's not on you as the educator, right? Okay, well they've come to me, and so they've come to me from an environment where this behavior served a purpose. It was adaptive. It was adaptive. It helped them adapt. We're very adaptable. At some point, that behavior helped them adapt. And so they can't adapt in my class because you're getting sent out. But by and large, people are wired for anxiety, kids and people that come through a lot of ACEs, and really they have too much cortisol and too much energy. And that's what's going on. And here's this talks about the brain consequences. I think this is important for us to recognize. There are specific parts of the brain that are impacted, and this has become more sophisticated. There's actually some frontal cortex that gets involved as well, but the hippocampus is smaller in people who have been through a lot of trauma and adverse childhood experiences, higher numbers of ACEs, which means their memories are not as sharp. They don't make or retain memories as easily as other people who haven't been through a lot of ACEs. How is that adaptive? Well, if you've been through a lot of crappy experiences, I don't want to remember all that stuff. I don't want to be in a situation where I'm forced to remember this event. And so the brain has ways of dealing with that. And so the hippocampus actually shrinks under a lot of allostatic load, a lot of stress. I'm going to stop right there. I think that I've gone on long enough, and I want to grab the hook because we're going to go into some more brain stuff. So I'm going to stop there to keep the video from going too long, but tune right back in for the corpus callosum.